the 11th chapter of the epistle to the Hebrews is a powerful chapter. It is a chapter that serves to define faith. Not only is faith defined, but the author spends time showing how faith is demonstrated. And these 2 points about the 11th chapter of Hebrews has been used in many lessons from this pulpit and among faithful brethren that have preached the true meaning of this powerful chapter. But also, when the writer speaks of faith, he includes the names of people, common people that had faith and that demonstrated, lived this particular faith. And the evidence that is mentioned proves the powerful results of faith plus works. It is often also referred as a chapter that contains the names of heroes of faith. These men and women that are mentioned here, for example, Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, and Sarah, just here to mention at the beginning. About 16 people are mentioned in this particular chapter, that their lives help to define faith. And it demonstrates how faith was lived by these men and women, and how their behavior, their lives, served to exemplify faith, biblical faith. But there's something else in this chapter 11 that I want to address this morning, and that is that you also have people that are unnamed in chapter 11 and that are included in the list of these heroes of faith. And in order to stay within the context, I want to read. And if you can follow along, I'd appreciate this. Beginning with verse 32 of chapter 11. And listen carefully to what the writer has to say about these that are unnamed. And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouth of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword. Out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trial of mockings and scourgings, yes, and of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains, in dens and caves of the earth. This is just a brief summation of the lives of these people that are considered as the others. You have those that are named, and now the writer is talking and writing, that is, about those that are not named. I want to point out to you several things that stand out in this particular chapter 11. And we're going to address the lives of these others that have no name. We don't know. We can guess, and we can go back into the Old Testament and bring up the lives of some of these men and women that lived their faith and became heroes, outstanding examples of people of faith. Let me begin by pointing out that these unnamed heroes of faith were both men and women. When you go back to chapter 11 and you go back to verse 2, the writer refers to these people as the elders. Some versions refer to them as the older men. But make no mistake, he's not only pointing towards the faith of men, but there are women that are mentioned here. And you begin, of course, with the name of Sarah, as we talked at the very beginning. But even then, when the writer speaks, he speaks especially of women, when he addresses how they receive their dead raised to life again in verse 35. But I want to notice what the writer says about these particular unnamed heroes of faith. Out of weakness were made strong. Let me tell you, that is in reference to their physical abilities. Out of weakness, they were the small people that were limited in their abilities, people that were limited in their recourses, people that did not have the means to succeed in life. But yet, when it was time for them to stand up for truth, for right, for justice, they were made strong. They were valiant in battle, he makes the statement. So although we do not know the names of these heroes of faith, we do know that out of weakness they were made strong. But notice something else that the writer mentions in verse 35 of chapter 11. When he says about these others that were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. They were given the opportunity to deny their faith. They were given the opportunity to survive the torture. They were given the opportunity to sell their conviction. But these unnamed heroes, they stood their ground. They backed up their faith. They stood up to injustice. They stood up to that temptation of selling their convictions, and they did not sell their convictions. There were people that were genuine, people that were true, people that were understanding the meaning of having faith in God and following His example. So this is a very positive characteristic of these people, that we have no idea who they were because they are not named in chapter 11. But there's something else that I want to point out to you about these unnamed heroes. From verse 35 on down to verse 38, we are given a description of how these people of faith lived their humiliation. And I want you just to go back and look at what he says. That these were tortured. And in verse 36, still others had trial of mockings and scourgings, yes, and of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, afflicted, tormented. They wandered in deserts and mountains, in dens and caves of the earth. Read on. Read on. Imagine what you want, and these words have a meaning. They were written to describe the daily lives. These words were written to point out the severity of this embarrassment. They were embarrassed. They were mocked. They had to flee. They didn't have a house of their own. They had to go from one place to the other. They had to provide their own clothing out of sheep and goat. These people were persecuted. They had to live a life that was horrible and humiliating. It was not done privately only, but it was done publicly. They were put before the public, and people would mock and laugh at them. These were the heroes of faith. These were those that we don't know their name, but yet they lived their humiliation privately and publicly. But there's something else here that is very strong. In verse 38, the writer says, of whom the world was not worthy. Now think for a minute to the meaning of this word. The world said that these men were not worthy. Worthless people, unworthy, unproductive. These were not approved. These were not accepted. They didn't fit society. They didn't belong in society. There was not a place for them in society. They were not considered worthy of anything. What in the world are these people doing in our world? These people were claiming. These unnamed heroes of faith survive the mocking, the hate that was shown by the world, because according to the world, these people, these men and women of faith, were not worthy to be a part of their lives. there's something else here that I want to point out. And this is the most important point that I want to make in this lesson. That the writer also points to the fact that these unnamed heroes of faith, they were no less than those that were named. You know, this is very important because among society, people want their name to be mentioned. I can remember growing up in school, in the neighborhood where we lived, even in the church that we would attend, the places that we went to. When television came into our lives, I remember the importance of being recognized, how important it is for people to be recognized in society. You go to a party, you go to some festivity, you go to some place, and it is a tremendous honor when someone stands up and says, Mr. So-and-so is here. You know, it just swells up the ego because your name was mentioned, because people recognize you by name. And the people or the person that is standing there at the corner, that no one goes by to shake his hand, no one goes by there to say good morning, or nobody say, well, welcome to the party. He stands aside. People belittle that person. But in the case of Hebrews chapter 11, in the case of these that are unnamed, they were no less than those that were named. How do we know? Let's read. Let's read chapter 11, beginning with verse 13. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. Go back at the beginning of verse 13. It says, these all. Those that are named and those that are not named. Verse 14. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they, all of these, desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. All of these named and unnamed. Drop down to verse 39. And all these, who are these? The unnamed and those that are named, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise. God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. Now there's more here, I know. But for now, listen carefully. The named and the unnamed, they were all recognized. And the writer says that God is not ashamed to be called their God. God is not ashamed to be called their God. From the very beginning of chapter 11, in verse 2 and in verse 5, the writer sets the record straight For by it the elders obtained a good testimony. These men and women of faith from the very beginning obtained a good testimony. And in verse 5, when he speaks of Enoch, he had this testimony. What was the testimony that he had? That he pleased God. These that are named, these that are not named, these all pleased God. Now this is what the writer wrote to the Hebrews. But you know what? I want you to know something. That when the writer was writing to the Hebrews, before chapter 11, in chapter 6, I want to read from verses 9 through 12. And I want you to follow what he's telling now his readers. He's not talking about the demands placed upon the dead. They lived their life. They fixed their destination at the point of death. But now he's talking to those that the writer was addressing, the Hebrews. Listen to the Hebrews, what he was telling them, beginning with verse 9. But, beloved, we are confident of better things concerning you. Yes, things that accompany salvation, though we speak in this manner. For God is not unjust to forget your work and labor of love, which you have shown toward his name, in that you have ministered to the saints and do minister. And we desire that each one of you show the same diligence to the full assurance of hope until the end, that you do not become sluggish, but imitate, listen, but imitate those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. Look at the heroes of faith. Look at those that are named. Look at those that are not named. If God was not unjust to forget their work and labor of love, the writer is telling the Hebrews, God will not forget you. The Hebrews would join the named and the unnamed. And dearly beloved, these examples are our example. And these are the example that challenge our faith on a daily basis.